quoted Yanan's plan for Israel in the 1980s, it lays out very clearly a strategy of destabilizing all of the surrounding areas of Israel. This includes Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, Iraq, and even Egypt and Saudi Arabia. And this long-term goal is part of the Greater Israel Project. So in terms of the sectarian divide you see happening in Iraq today, it's actually all part of a very well-designed plan to try and secure the goal, this fantasy goal of the Greater Israel Project.
Okay, but why would Israel benefit from an unstable Middle East, unstable Arab nations? Because what we see that this instability actually is followed by fundamental Islam, and people who are overthrown are either replaced by fundamentalist powers, or there's just more sectarian violence that grows.
Yes, and it would seem on the surface from a sane point of view that everything is going wrong. But in fact, when you fracture a country along sectarian divide, ultimately you weaken the country. What the last thing that Israel or the United States wants is a strong Nasser-type leader, an Arab nationalist who will seriously ensure that the resources of that country are taken and protected and used for the benefit of the people. That's the last thing that the empire wants and that Israel wants. So while you have these religious fundamentalist nutcases who are running around bombing and doing all sorts of stuff like that, you have a weakened, fractured country in Iraq, and that is the prerequisite for ultimately expanding Israel into the fantasy of the Greater Israel Project. It doesn't seem sane, and it's not sane, because those who are trying to carry out these agendas are pure and simple psychopaths.
And so you think that American administrations, one after another, have been following this plan for 30 years?
If you ask me how the world functions, then you have to understand one thing plain and simple. The head of the snake, the system of power, is headed by the financial system. The bankers rule the earth through the private control of the issuance of money, debt-based money, which we're all supposed to pay, ultimately with all of these things that they call austerity and whatnot. The bankers basically, through the control of the issuance of money, which allows them to provide themselves with an infinite supply of money, means they can buy anything and anyone that can be bought. So when we look at the vast majority of governments around the world, they're nothing more than puppets who are carrying out an agenda for the bankers. And the bankers at the top of this pyramid are, as I've said, plain and simple psychopaths. They're drunk on their own power. They're used to getting everything they want. They can buy anything and anyone that can be bought. And this explains the corruption of virtually every government we can look at. And the policies do not reflect the interests of the people. They reflect pure and simple the interests of the bankers.
But Kenneth, if what you're saying is true, that governments obey the big banks and the big money, then it would really take the people and revolution in each country that you have named to actually change things around. Do you really see revolution taking place in America, for example?
It's already happening. I'll give you a great example of why I'm optimistic about things in America. You know, the President of the United States, traitor that he is actually a constitutional lawyer. He's actually trained at the highest levels of university in constitutional law. Do you know how obscene it is that somebody who is trained in constitutional law, giving himself the authority to execute anyone, anywhere, at any part of the planet with no jury, no trial, no conviction, no nothing? This man is a dictator who has assigned himself the right to execute anyone, including U.S. citizens. I am confident that at some point the American patriots, who seem to be in a bit of a coma and have been sleeping for a long time, are going to wake up soon and realize that while they took an oath to uphold the Constitution of the United States, the President of the United States also took that oath and has breached it so badly that he should be arrested and charged with treason right now. And ultimately, all of the sycophants in the U.S. Congress who passed things like the Patriot Act and the National Defense Authorization Act, again, completely contrary to the U.S. Constitution, which is supposed to be the supreme law of the land, these people need to be arrested. And a government needs to be put in place that actually honors the U.S. Constitution. And I honestly believe that's going to happen. One way or the other, it's going to happen.
But you just started your answer by saying that the revolution is already happening. So where's the revolution that you're talking about?
I'll tell you what, this is another thing that really excites me, Sophie, because while you're not seeing it, apparently, and many other people may not be seeing it, let me give you a perfect example where the revolution has already occurred, and the first step of that revolution is awareness. No one is more hopelessly enslaved than those who falsely believe they are free. The people of the world are starting to realize that they have been enslaved in a financial system which is effectively selling the future of their children down the river. More and more people are becoming aware of that. They're also sick and tired of being lied to about one boogeyman after another. And ultimately, what happened in Syria, this is a key point, and I really want to make this point before we move on to the next one, because it's talking about the revolution that you're referring to. The reason why we did not hit Syria, the reason why we did not start bombing Syria, is a one simple thing, and that is that the people of the West and the world simply did not buy it. They didn't have to go on the street and protest. Keep in mind, back in 2003, we had the largest protest in the history of the world, did not stop the invasion of Iraq. But I'm telling you, the invasion and the occupation and ultimately the bombardment of Syria has been planned long ago. It's a stepping stone towards Iran, which is the ultimate goal for these psychopaths, and they could not bombard Syria, and the reason why they couldn't even vote to secure that vote to favor that here in Britain is because the people overwhelmingly did not buy it. In the United States, the approval for bombardment of Syria was about 9%. That's why the U.S. Congress, which is a treasonous body of government, couldn't even go to a vote on it, because if they went to a vote on it and actually voted for another war, and this farcical war on terror, where the fantastic American servicemen took pictures of themselves saying, I did not join the U.S. military to fight with Al-Qaeda in Syria, says it all. If they had made that move, there would have been an open revolution. The powers that be know that the people are primed and ready to take major steps to stop this. And again, American patriots are going to go into the Congress and the White House eventually and arrest these cowards and traitors. But it's under the surface right now. It's getting ready. And to show the power of the people, ultimately, we did not go into Syria. This is because the people did not provide the one key element for the powers that be, and that is their consent. If they don't have our consent, they can't do a damn thing. The point that I'm making is that the U.S. president has given himself the authority to execute anyone, anywhere, anytime, for any pretext, any bogus reason. Is that more of a problem to the world than Bashar al-Assad? Of course it is. It's much more of a problem that the President of the United States says he can execute anyone, anywhere, anytime. And yet we're sitting here talking about Bashar al-Assad, which, granted, this man has committed crimes in Syria. There's no question of that. But when we look at the U.S. President, when we look at Israel, when we look at the Britain, this alliance, this true axis of evil between these three countries, the amount of devastation that has occurred in Iraq and Afghanistan and other parts of the world, Yemen, Pakistan, is so devastating, I think it's beggars belief that we as people can be conned into thinking that Bashar al-Assad is the problem, or that Ahmadinejad was the problem. We are the problem. We in the West are the problem, especially the United States government. So it really is quite ridiculous that we get manipulated into saying, oh, we have to take care of this problem over there. The problem is in our own backyard, and we know this. We've got to take care of our dirty, filthy house of corruption. The United States Congress is nothing but a den of traitors, the most sycophantic, disgusting traitors you can imagine. And the White House has got a dictator. This is a problem. This is a major problem, much bigger problem than what's happening in Syria with Bashar al-Assad.
Now, you have great knowledge and strong opinions about events in the Middle East. Iran has recently softened its attitude towards its opponent after decades of deadlock. Israel is annoyed, and how do you see that developing?
I think it's a reflection of the sanity of the people around the world who realize that any kind of attack on Iran is tantamount to initiating a full-scale Third World War, which of course could very well and inevitably would lead to a war with China and Russia. This is pure madness. And those of us who've lost loved ones or who have served in combat, like myself, and others who know the devastating cost of war, not just for the so-called victor, because the only victor really is the bankers, quite frankly, but even those who supposedly on the winning side suffer greatly. And testimony to that fact, aside from the 1 million to 2 million dead in Iraq, is the 22 American servicemen a day who are committing suicide because of the horrendous things that they were called to do in places like Afghanistan and Iraq. So this policy now, this shift in policy to actually resolve this conflict with Iran, this false conflict in truth, is a reflection of the will of the people, if you ask me, which is starting to achieve the goal.
So you think Netanyahu is bluffing? Because I've spoken to a couple of Israeli parliamentarians, I've spoken to Israelis, and they're all for a strike.
Yes. No, I don't think that he's bluffing. He's an absolute psychopath. And he reflects the agenda for the powers that be in Israel. Each one of these players, Netanyahu, George Bush, Obama, Cameron, they're all puppets, and they're all supposed to read a different script at different times, depending on what the agenda is. The agenda is shifting slightly, and it looks like Israel and the people of Israel, the Jewish state of Israel, are like sheep being led to slaughter. Because ultimately the policies of Israel are completely and totally unsustainable. Even the CIA said in 2009 that Israel would not even exist within 20 years. Henry Kissinger himself said it wouldn't exist within 10 years. And the reason why is because its policies are totally self-destructive, and the puppet masters are quite happy to sacrifice the people of Israel. They're going to destroy themselves if they do attack Iran, because Iran can fight back and does have allies, and a lot of countries are sick and tired of Israel's threats to both its immediate neighbors and even to the rest of the world. When we look at the Samson option, I encourage people to Google Samson option and look at the
still working on that. He'll be back in just a second here. That's Ken OKeefe that's talking. Ken OKeefe was involved in some of these Gaza rescues. The flotilla that was invaded, he was on board. I think he's kind of feels like Hawaii is his hometown here. And we're looking at this 1123. And the point he's making, first of all, it's the same point I've been trying to hammer into your heads for 20 years. The banksters are the problem. The Rothschilds, the Rockefellers, the Bushes, all banksters, all with their hands in starting World War II, World War I, and continuing that program of endless war. And the bankers fund both sides. Ken O'Keefe just told you the same thing. And he's doing it from a different place. I think he's over in London right now, but he certainly ain't happy with the Rothschild, City of London, the Vatican, and Washington, D.C. are the three cities of power. The sisters, that horror of Babylon, the horrors of Babylon, I guess you should say. And we've really got to ask ourselves, I mean, this is what I've got up on both my website and Blog Talk, that we are approaching an interesting turning point in history. Should American patriots ally themselves with Putin and the Russian people who were victimized by communism, the Jewish-based communism? Some people call it communism. I call it Judaism for the master, for the masses, said Rabbi Weiss. They've been victimized by communism for the last century. Russia has broken out. And both Russia and China are getting a little tired of all this. So they have formed what they refer to in the political, in the mainstream agenda, the Zionist-controlled agenda, that they refer to it as BRICS. That's Brazil, Russia, Iran, and China. They're setting up an alternate to the Federal Reserve System. And what you need to know is, financially, Russia's position is so solid that even the three Western credit rating agencies don't have the gall to downgrade Russia's rating, sanctions notwithstanding. This is a country that is aggressively paying down its foreign debt, is running a record high budget surplus, has a positive balance of payments, is piling up physical gold reserves, and not a month goes by that it doesn't sign a major international trade deal that circumvents the U.S. dollar. In comparison, the U.S. is a dead man walking unless it can continue rolling over trillions of dollars in short-term debt every month at record low interest rates. It won't be able to pay the interest on its debt or bills. Goodbye welfare state. Hello riots. Goodbye military contractors and federal law enforcement. Hello mayhem and open borders. It must be understood that at this point the American ruling elite
threat that Israel is posed to the world if things don't go its way.
But when you talk about the United States is Israel's main supporter, but right now we see that it's kind of open to Iran as well, knowing how much anxiety that raises among Israelis. What does it tell you about the U.S.?
It tells me that the people are beginning to realize their power. I think there's things that correlate. The approval rating for Barack Obama in the U.S. Congress is about as low as it's possible to get, somewhere in the neighborhood of 10%, 20% maximum. The people have come to a point where they are sick and tired of being lied to. They know they're being lied to. And when they see their so-called leaders trying to cooperate with Israel in yet another war that would lead to disastrous consequences for the region and for the United States and every other person involved, they've had it. And the reflection of the policies is indeed that of the people. It's the people who are sick and tired. And I do see that there is some demarcation going on here between Israel and the United States, but this is because the power of the people is rising. And as we saw in Syria, the Congress and the president was all basically saying the red line was crossed, blah, 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 blah. And this blatantly false flag attack in Ghouta in Syria has backfired. They were not able to carry out this agenda, and this is only empowering the people that much further.
So you think Iran should be allowed to develop its nuclear program?
I think it's absolutely hypocritical and insane that we would sit here and fixate on Iran and its supposed nuclear weapons program, which I don't believe exists. But nonetheless, who could blame Iran if they were developing a nuclear weapon? If the United States and the West taught any lesson to the rest of the world with the invasion and occupation of Iraq, it was that Saddam Hussein was a fool for actually disarming, because by disarming, all he did was make it that much easier for the empire to come in and destroy the entire country. So the lesson we teach to the world is that the best way to defend yourself is to get yourself a nuclear weapon. And of course, the biggest culprit of using nuclear weapons and producing nuclear weapons and weapons of mass destruction is my birth nation of the United States. And I find it absolutely insane that we sit here and talk about Iran's supposed nuclear weapons program when we know the United States is producing every kind of weapon under the sun, is spending more than every other military on the planet combined, and is involved in more war and more death and more suffering than every other nation combined, and yet it's sitting there on a pedestal talking about other nations developing weapons of mass destruction.
Now, what you need to understand here is, at this point, the American ruling elite is almost entirely senile. And I'll try to illustrate that to you shortly. And what do we do? Should we stop? Here we are defending, and we're trying to be patriotic. This is part of our brainwashing. And some of it's justified. I mean, I took an oath, like Ken O'Keefe did, to defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. No expiration date on that oath. And, however, when I volunteered for Vietnam, and I ended up not going because they tried to kill me with their vaccinations, with their routines, tried to test to get into officers candidate school, and was turned down. I said, hey, wait a minute, man, I never failed a test in my life. Oh, you didn't fail the test. You scored so high on the test they won't let you be an officer. Someone with your IQ will question orders. Well, it's time for you Americans to get your shit together and realize I'm just telling you the truth here. I didn't go to Vietnam, and I'm glad I didn't, because they tried to kill us over there. I'm 67 to 68 years old, and a lot of my brothers didn't make it this long, didn't make it this far, because they've been sprayed with Agent Orange, they've been hit with depleted uranium, they've been hit with the vaccinations, massive vaccinations that give you the diseases that they're supposed to defend you against. Just a mild case, though. You can get by. Let's let Ken O'Keefe finish, and we'll get on and talk about Russia. Should we be supporting Putin? Maybe we would be better off under Putin than Barack Hussein Obama, a traitor in charge of our government, and that's selling us out and working with the whole Muslim culture that they're trying to demonize. They get a few radicals over there to go out and kill some Christians, and then they try to blame it on all Russians. Ken, let's try to finish up, please.
It's insane that we even allow them to do this. The first nation that needs to disarm, without question, is the United States. And the first nation to be charged with war crimes and crimes against humanity is the United States. Once we start seeing actions like this, then we'll know that people in positions of power are serious, because ultimately the rest of the world is sick and tired of the impunity and the continuous threats of a third world war. So we've reached a point now where human beings around the planet are realizing we can't do this. We can't have a third world war. This is not a game.
Okay.
I think that every nation should disarm right now. Every nation that has a weapons program should be inspected by a legitimate international body, and those nations with the highest amount of weapons of mass destruction, nuclear weapons, are the first ones to start disarming. And when those nations start disarming, then I would say that the rest of the world will also have to show that it's disarming as well. But while the United States is able to maintain the largest military might in the history of this world and continues to use those weapons against all of the countries, I only see it as a pure hypocrisy that the West would say that other countries can't have such things. I don't want any weapons in this world, but it's not right for us in the West, in particular the United States, to say that we can have all these weapons and the rest of the world will bomb you to the Stone Age if you even try to think to defend yourself. It's beyond hypocrisy. It's ridiculous. The U.S. needs to disarm first, and the world needs to insist on that.
Now, I've read in your blog that you said this world needs one thing above all others, and that's sanity. But doesn't sanity depend on what side of the argument you're on?
No, I think we were all sane when we were children, and unfortunately what passes as education is actually indoctrination, and through indoctrination we've turned into largely a bunch of dupes who've enslaved ourselves without even knowing it. But when you regain the capacity to think for yourself, to actually become human, it becomes very clear. For instance, if we look at these politicians who historically lied to us over and over and over again, and we realize that the war-making industries are absolutely inherently interested in perpetuating war, and if we look at the people in positions of power and we see how they continuously reap major bonuses with the banks, they get bailouts to the tune of trillions, and yet we're being told that we're not working hard enough, that we're in debt, all of these things combined lead us to a point where we've reached that certain level of sanity and realize, you know what? This entire system does not represent me, and in fact, every single person on this planet is fighting the same enemy, and that enemy uses the financial system to enslave all of us. It doesn't take a genius to figure this out. In fact, more and more people are figuring this out, and a point of sanity brings us to a point where we realize, enough, this is a game that cannot be played. We're risking our own collective suicide here, and as a sane person, I will not contribute in any way towards this never-ending policy of war, which is leading us to the brink of destruction. And this is not about being intelligent. This is about being sane, first and foremost. The average person can understand this very easily.
I know that you have renounced U.S. citizenship more than twice, 3 times, I think, right? So having the U.S. passport is a dream for so many people. What's so wrong with it? I mean, you don't have to agree with U.S. policies, but is America all that bad?
When you look at citizenship, you have to understand that citizenship is a contract. It's a social contract between the state and the citizen. Under that contract, you have supposedly rights, and you also have obligations. Now, I looked at the obligations of being a U.S. citizen, and I realized I cannot pay into a tax system, which is basically paying off debt to the bankers. But nonetheless, we pay into a tax system which is used to produce military capability, which is ultimately killing my brothers and sisters in other parts of the world. I do not agree to contributing to a tax system that is being used to commit mass murder against people I consider to be my brothers and sisters halfway around the world. It's a violation of my ethics as a man, as someone who believes in justice for everyone and wants a better world for everyone. I cannot pay for the murder of my brother or sister, and that's part of the contract of citizenship. So I said, which was to me a sensible thing and a moral thing to do, take my name off of that contract because I do not agree to it, and ultimately I will walk away. And I left a paradise life in Hawaii. I had my own business. I was making money, lived on the beach, did something I loved. You know, I had a beautiful, beautiful life, and I walked from that because I absolutely 100% disagree with the actions of my birth nation and find them so criminal that I need my name to be taken off that list. I will enter into a contract again with the United States if indeed it carries itself with honor and will respect the U.S. Constitution. If the U.S. Constitution is indeed made the supreme law of the United States, then I will happily come back to my nation and adhere to the contract. I would argue probably the reason why they have not honored my right of self-determination, a human right of self-determination, is because it could set a precedent, which could spark an imaginative idea that people could look at around the world and say, you know what, I don't actually agree with this contract with my nation any longer. I want to enter into a new contract. This is why I refer to myself as a world citizen. We're all world citizens. My human family is where my allegiance goes. I don't give my allegiance to one unit, one group, one nation, one religion. My whole human family is a brother and sister, and ultimately I give my allegiance to them. That's the contract I will honor. And if any other contract inferior to that one would try to compel me to pay for the murder of my brother or sister, I will not partake in that contract. I will not pay into the UK tax system and fund the murder of my brothers and sisters halfway around the world. I simply refuse to do it. And I would argue that other people should look at a contract like that. And maybe if we all decide to enter into a new contract like that, we can end war for good.
So you say you're a world citizen. Is there any place that you love more than others? Why are you living in the UK if you don't like UK policies?
I love Hawaii. My adopted homeland is Hawaii, and the Hawaiian nation was stolen by the United States in 1893, and yet there are my Hawaiian brothers and sisters who are Hawaiian nationals and who know who they are and have not forgotten who they are and take pride in who they are. If they have their way and I have my way, the Hawaiian nation will no longer be a military outpost for the United States launching its wars of aggression against everybody, the latest boogeyman. Hawaii is the place that I long to live. I plan to return there, but I want the empire out of Hawaii. Hawaii is not an extension of the U.S. empire. It is a Hawaiian nation, and the people of Hawaii, the Kanaka Maoli, deserve to have their nation back.
All right, that was Ken OKeefe, and I think he stated it pretty well. Not sure I could do better. Now, the article that I've got linked up here is Russia Rising. Russia is on the way up. America on the way down. Will Washington start a major new war as a desperate attempt to reverse its decline and deal a death blow to an increasingly confident competitor? An edited abridgment of Dmitry Orlov's How to Start a War and Lose an Empire, presented with pictures, captions, and comments by Lasha Darkmoon. A year and a half, she says, I wrote an essay on how the U.S. chooses to view Russia, titled An Image of the Enemy. I was living in Russia at the time, and after observing American anti-Russian rhetoric and Russian reaction to it, I made some observations that seemed important at the time. It turns out that I managed to spot an important trend, but given the quick pace of development since then, those observations are now woefully out of date, so here's an update. At the time, the stakes weren't very high yet. There was much noise around a fellow named Majinsky, a corporate lawyer crook who got caught and died in pretrial custody. He had been holding items for some bigger Western crooks who, of course, were never apprehended. The Americans chose to treat this as a human rights violation and responded with the so-called Magnitsky Act, which sanctioned certain Russian individuals who were labeled as human rights violators. The Russians responded with the Dimi Yakolov bill, named after a Russian orphan adopted by Americans who killed him by leaving him in a locked car for 9 hours. This bill banned American orphan killing friends from adopting any more Russian orphans. It all amounted to a silly bit of melodrama, but what a difference a year and a half has made. The Ukraine, which was at that time collapsing at about the same steady pace as it had been ever since its independence 2 decades ago, is now truly a defunct state with its economy in free fall, one region gone and 2 more in open rebellion, much of the country terrorized by the oligarch-funded death squads, and some American anointed puppets nominally in charge but quaking in their boots about what's coming next. Syria and Iraq, which were then at a low simmer, have since erupted into full-blown war with large parts both now under the control of the Islamic Caliphate, which was formed with help of the U.S. and was armed with U.S.-made weapons via the Iraqis. Post-Gaddafi, Libya seems to be working on establishing an Islamic Caliphate of its own against this backdrop of profound U.S. foreign policy failure. The U.S. recently saw fit to accuse Russia of having troops on NATO's doorstep, as if this had nothing to do with the fact that NATO has expanded east all the way to Russian borders. And there's a chart here. You can see it when you go to the links on my freeamerican.com website or my Facebook Free American 69 site. You click on Russia Rising, and you can see the U.S. military troops and bases all over the world. And we've got 63 countries with U.S. military bases and troops. 154 countries with U.S. troops. And 7 countries with 13 new U.S. military bases since 2001. In 2001, the U.S. had 255,000 troops abroad. Now, surprisingly, the United States military is currently deployed in more locations than it has been throughout history. And the sources are the Department of Defense, folks. So, surprisingly, U.S.-Russia relations have now reached a point where the Russians saw it fit to issue a stern warning. Further Western attempts at blackmailing them may result in nuclear confrontation. The American behavior throughout the succession of defeats has been remarkably consistent, with the constant element being their flat refusal to deal with reality in any way, shape, or form, just as before. In Syria, the Americans are ever looking for moderate pro-Western Islamists who want to do what the Americans won't, topple the government of Bashar al-Assad, but will stop at short of going on to destroy all the infidel invaders they can get their hands on. The fact that such moderate pro-Western Islamists do not seem exist does not affect American strategy in the region in any way. Similarly, in the Ukraine, the fact that heavy American investment in freedom and democracy or open society or what have you has produced a government dominated by fascists and a civil war, according to Americans, just some Russian propaganda parading under the banner of Hitler's Ukrainian SS division and anointing Nazi collaborators as national heroes is just not convincing enough for them. So what do these Nazis have to do to prove they're Nazis? Build some oven and roast some Jews, just massacring people by setting fire to a building, as they did in Odessa, or shooting unarmed citizens in the back and tossing them into mass graves, as they did in Donetsk, doesn't seem to work. The fact that many people have refused to be ruled by Nazi thugs, have successfully resisted them, and has caused the Americans to label them as pro-Russian separatists. This, in turn, was used to blame the troubles in Ukraine on Russia and to impose sanctions on Russia. The sanctions would be reviewed if Russia were to withdraw its troops from the Ukraine. The problem is, there are no Russian troops in the Ukraine. Note that this sort of behavior is nothing new. The Americans invaded Afghanistan, supposedly, because the Taliban would not relinquish Osama bin Laden, who was a CIA operative, unless Americans produced evidence and implicated him in 9/11, which did not exist. Americans invaded Iraq because Saddam Hussein would not relinquish his weapons of mass destruction, which did not exist. They invaded Libya because Muammar Gaddafi would not relinquish official positions, which he did not hold. They were ready to invade Syria because Bashar al-Assad had used chemical weapons against his own people, which he did not do. Now they impose sanctions on Russia because Russia had destabilized and invaded Ukraine. which it did not do either. The U.S. did that. The sanctions against Russia have been have an additional sort of unreality to them because they boomerang and hurt the West while giving the Russian government the impetus to do what it wanted to do all along. The sanctions infringed on the rights of a number of Russian businessmen and officials who promptly yanked their money out of Western banks, pulled their children out of Western schools and universities, and did everything they could to demonstrate they are good, patriotic Russians, not American lackeys. The sanctions affected a number of Russian energy companies, cutting them off from Western sources of technology and financing, but this will primarily hurt the earnings of the Western energy companies while helping their Chinese competitors. There are even some threats to cut Russia off from the SWIFT system, which would make it quite difficult to transfer funds between Russia and the West. But what these threats did instead was give Russia the impetus to introduce its own SWIFT system, which will include even Iran, neutralizing future American efforts at imposing financial sanctions. The sanctions were meant to cause economic damage, but the Western efforts at inflicting short-term economic damage on Russia are failing. Coupled with a significant drop in the price of oil, all of this was supposed to hurt Russia fiscally, but since the sanctions caused the ruble to drop in tandem, the net result on Russia's state finances is a wash. Oil prices are lower, but then, thanks in part to the sanction, so is the ruble, and since oil revenues are still largely in dollars, this means Russian tax receipts are roughly at the same level as before, and since Russian oil companies earn dollars abroad but spend rubles domestically, their production budgets remain unaffected. The Russians are responded by imposing some counter-sanctions to take quick steps to neutralize the effect of the sanctions on them. Russia banned the import of produce from the European Union, to the horror of farmers there. Especially hurt were these EU members who are especially anti-Russian. The Baltic states, which swiftly lost a large fraction of their GDP, along with Poland. An exception is being made for Serbia, which refused to join into the sanctions. Now here the message is simple. Friendships that have lasted many centuries matter. What the Americans want is not what the Americans get, and the EU is merely a piece of paper. A goddamn piece of paper. Thus, the counter-sanctions are driving wedges between the U.S. and the EU, and within the EU, behind Eastern Europe, which the sanctions are hurting the most, and Western Europe, and most importantly, they drive home the simple message that the U.S. is not Europe's friend. There's something else going on that is going to become more significant in the long run. Russia has taken a hint and is turning away from the West and towards the East. It is delaying its open defiance of American attempts at world domination into trade relationships throughout the world, much of which is sick and tired of paying tribute to Washington. Russia is playing a key role in putting together an international banking system that circumvents the U.S. dollar and the U.S. Federal Reserve. That's the BRICS country, the BRICS movement, and these efforts, over half of the world's territory and population, is squarely on Russia's side and cheering loudly. Thus, the effort to isolate Russia has produced the opposite of the intended result. It is isolating the West from the rest of the world instead. In other ways, the sanctions are actually being helpful. The import ban on foodstuffs from the EU is a positive boon to domestic agriculture, while driving home a politically important point. Don't take food from the hands of those who bite you. Russia is already one of the world's largest grain exporters, and there's no reason it can't become entirely self-sufficient in food. But this is only the beginning. The Russians seem to have finally realized to what extent the playing field has been slanted against them. They've been forced to play by Washington rules in two key ways: by bending to Washington's will in order to keep their credit ratings high, and the three key credit ratings agencies in order to secure access to Western credit, and by playing by the Western rule book when issuing credit of their own, thus keeping domestic interest rates artificially high. The result was that the U.S. companies were able to finance their operations more cheaply, making them more competitive. But now, as Russia works quickly to get out from under the U.S. dollar, shifting trade to bilateral currency arrangements backed by some amount of gold, should trade imbalances develop, it is also looking for ways to turn the printing press to its advantage. Here I am, guys. To date, the dictate handed down from Washington has been, you can print money, we can print money all we like, but you can't or we will destroy you. But this threat is ringing increasingly hollow, and Russia will no longer be using its dollar revenues to buy up U.S. debt. One proposal currently on the table would make it impossible to pay for Russian oil exports with anything other than rubles by establishing two oil brokerages, one in St. Petersburg and the other 7 time zones away in Vladivostok. Foreign oil buyers would then have to earn their petro rubles the honest way through bilateral trade, or if they can't make enough stuff that the Russians want to import, they could pay for oil with gold while supplies last, or the Russians could simply print rubles, and to make sure printing does not cause domestic inflation, they could export some inflation by playing with the oil spigot and the oil export tariffs. And if the likes of George Soros decide to attack the ruble in an effort to devalue it, Russia could defend its currency simply by printing fewer rubles for a while. No need to stockpile dollar reserves. So far, this all seemed like typical economic warfare. The Americans want to get everything they want by printing money while bombing into submission or sanctioning anyone who disobeys them, while the rest of the world attempts to resist them. But in early 2014, the situation changed. Now let's check. See how we're doing in Blog Talk. Truck driving man is still there. You still there, truck driving man? Alright. We've had problems with the Blog Talk chat room. I don't know where people are. I don't know if they're there. We'll try to do a little reboot here for this particular one and see if we can see if we got anybody hiding there in the shadows, since I haven't seen much action on this thing. Now, folks, I'm giving you some straight scoop here. And, of course, that keeps me still under the attack. Frankly, they're scared to death of not just me, but people like me. People that are not brainwashed, not programmed, and they don't care much for that. They don't care much for that. Alright. We have gotten reconnected with the server. And I see, alright, good. Dr. D Charge is there. Spinning my coffee. That's David Koss. You can look up New Cure for Cancer on YouTube and understand about what David's tried to tell you. Spinning my coffee right now, David. LWW's there. And Phil from Canada is there. Hi guys, glad you could make it. Glad you could finally get into the chat room. And we're still cooking here. I said early in 2014 the situation between us and Russia changed. There was a U.S.-inspired coup in Kyiv, and instead of rolling over and playing dead like they were supposed to do, the Russians mounted a fast and brilliantly successful campaign to regain Crimea, thus successfully checkmating the junta in Kyiv and preventing it from consolidating control over the remaining former Ukrainian territory by letting volunteers, weapons, equipment, and humanitarian aid and hundreds of thousands of refugees exit through the strictly notional Russian-Ukrainian border, all while avoiding direct military confrontation with NATO. Seeing all of this happen on the nightly news has awakened the Russian population from its political slumber. Wish we could do that in America, making it sit up and pay attention and sending Putin's approval rating through the roof. Russians remember Russia's unique historical mission among the nations of the world. It is to thwart all other nations' attempt at world domination, be it Napoleonic France, Hitler-esque Germany, or Obama-maniac America. The U.S. domination tour. Bombing a country near you. 1945 to 1946, China. 1950 to 1953, Korea, China. 1954, Guatemala. 1958, Indonesia. 1959, Cuba. 1960, Guatemala. 1964, Congo. 1965, Peru. 1964 to 1973, Laos, Vietnam, Cambodia. 1967 to 1969, Guatemala. 1993, Grenada. 1983 to 84, Lebanon. 1980s, El Salvador. 1980s, Nicaragua. 1986, Libya. 1987, Iran. 1989, Panama. 1991, Iraq. 1993, Somalia. 1998, Sudan. 1998, Afghanistan. 1999, Yugoslavia. 2001, Afghanistan. 2003, Iraq. 2011, Libya. Coming soon, Venezuela, Iran, and Korea. Lasha Dogman says, shortly after 9/11, on September 2001, the U.S. embarked on a 5-year plan to take out 7 countries in 5 years. We have this on the authority of General Wesley Clark. According to Clark, an unnamed senior general of the Pentagon told him, we're going to take down 7 countries in 5 years. We're going to start with Iraq, then Syria, Lebanon, then Libya, Somalia, Sudan. We're going to come back and get Iran in 5 years. Well, it looks like the American warmongers are 8 years behind the schedule, because if things would have had worked out, they would have got Iran by September 2006. The Project for the New American Century, or PNAC, was a Washington-based think tank created in 1997. PNAC's aim? The establishment of a global American empire. Hang on, gotta do something here. Okay. Project for New American Century. Washington-based think tank created in 1907. PNAC's aimed the establishment of a global American empire which brought all other nations into subjugation under American hegemony. Central requirement was for the U.S. to fight and decisively win multiple simultaneous major theater wars. For this, they needed a pretext. I knew Pearl Harbor. This they managed to find by hook or crook in a remarkable short time. The catastrophe of 9/11 was so convenient for Israel and such a bonanza for the American arms industry. The entire thrust of world domination had the mark of international Jewry up on it. for it was through their control of America that the Jews sought to control the world. Apart from a handful of Jewified non-Jews such as Cheney, Rumsfeld, and Jeb Bush, the neoconservatives behind PNAC, the animating spirit, so to speak, were almost all Jews. Bernard Lewis, Paul Wolfowitz, Richard Pearl, Elliot Abrams, William Crystal, and the crypto Jew Rupert Murdoch. Right now we're at a dangerous crossroads. If the wrong road is taken, we can expect Armageddon, a Jew-created catastrophe such as the world has never known. Be right back. Hang on.
Constitution itself, all the resources in here are just tremendous, and I'll be glad to send you a copy of this if you'll send me enough for postage plus $1. Whatever you want to